Hey, everybody. Welcome back. And thank you, Marty, for that message on process and lost. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
um, yeah, of course. So we're going to just jump in as usual. And the first chapter that you talked about this week was the chapter on process. And so,
Mhm.
this idea that it is a day by day challenge and grind with our kids as being their parents, but one that we should take kind of honor in and recognize that God has already stepped into that role as a parent for us, accepting this day to day walk that He has in convicting and forgiving and changing and giving us grace for all of the ways in which we ourselves kind of struggle each day, and how neat it is to see that we could also step in and reflect God in this way as parents to our own children. I thought that was just a neat example and image that he kind of gave us in this chapter.
Oh, I was so convicted by this chapter, just thinking about, there was a time when I thought my words, just me saying words, me saying things clearly should have changed everything. Like,
Mm.
be quiet meant be quiet, right? And so my children would fail at that or whatever it was, right? And I just realized what an unrealistic expectation I have of the power of my own words or the power
Yeah.
of my own face, or the power of my own voice. And it took a long time for me to realize that those don't really change my children in the way that I really want them to change.
I think that's so true. And it's such a good reminder for us because I think of all the examples you just, shared, we can all resonate with at least one of those in
Mhm.
thinking that it holds a little bit more power than it actually does. If
Mhm.
in fact our, real goal and mission is to be changing the heart of our child, then we need to take notice of those things and really turn it over to God's character as our clear guide, as
Well, if
parents.
I would have thought that it was a process, maybe I wouldn't have scowled so much or had such an angry voice or whatever I was doing at the time. This whole idea of that parenting is a process actually gives us freedom to get a long view towards this whole transformation process.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. I also thought it was neat. One of the other things that I really took away from this chapter and feel like it's worth repeating is this idea of spiritual blindness. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to read it. Paul David Tripp says that spiritual blindness happens at the intersection of the deceptiveness of sin and the delusion of self knowledge. And so I can't tell you how many times I've probably sat right in the middle of those two things. One, being deceived by sin. So not thinking, that I am sinning, or just wanting to say, oh, that's not a big deal, and kind of letting it get a pass at times. And then this delusion of my own self knowledge that I have the solution, I have the answer to whatever challenge or struggle my child is facing, or in fact, myself is facing. And it allows us to just have blinders on at times for not really seeing clearly what God desires for us in that one situation, as well as this bigger picture mission of parenting as an ambassador of Christ.
Yeah, I think when we're parenting our children, those elements of deceit of sin and delusion of self knowledge, they're actually on both sides, right? The children have it, and we have it. Like
Mm-hmm.
we think we understand what the deceit of their sin is, and so we create a plan for how to deal with that, and then we believe that we are self sufficient, we have all the knowledge required in order to make that change happen. Well, our children are on the other side of the equation, kind of saying, "I don't see my sin like that. I don't see my sin at all, right? And I am fully capable of knowing what is sin, what is not, and what is good for me." And so we come
Mm-hmm.
at this parenting thing just full of ourselves, and a lot of delusions uh, get mixed up into it, and it becomes complicated for sure.
Definitely, definitely. And it's definitely a challenging place to be when everyone in the home thinks that they're kind of the one in charge and on top and right. So someone's kind of got to lay it down eventually, and recognize, the lack of control we actually have in the matter.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, I have a question for you then, on this topic of processing, and I'll just throw it at you. So, have you ever gotten irritated or upset at one of your children for just sheerly just needing you, and not seeing it maybe as this process of parenting, but kind of, getting a little bit more, irritated at the fact that they need you maybe again in something you've already addressed as a parent?
Wow, that's a great question. And what immediately comes to mind is when Laura and I lived in Little Rock and our kids were young. And so I was out working all day, and I was probably gone around 25 weekends a year doing marriage and parenting conferences for, of all things, right?
Of all things.
And so I would come home with this expectation that I would actually be able to recover because I felt like my job was pretty stressful. But what did I really know is that my kids probably had Laura tied up in knots, literal ropes and knots. And she was waiting for me to come home to be like the savior of her world, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't want to go home. Like I dreaded driving down the street.
Mm.
To me, walking in the front door sometimes felt like death. I mean, not terrible death, but it felt like no fun,
Yeah.
right? I was going to get the lowdown on what all the kids hadn't done right and what now I was supposed to do as the disciplinarian or the authoritarian. And I fundamentally felt like I didn't have the horsepower. I didn't have the internal fortitude to know even how to answer all the questions that were being asked of me.
Mhm.
So I kind of dreaded that. And I felt, I do remember the day though that I kind of came to the conclusion that, hey, this is a process and this is my job, right?
Yeah.
And so instead of seeing it look like death walking through my front door, I decided that on the other side of that door, the word life was up there, and
Mhm.
that it can sometimes feel like death, but it's really life. And I think that's the transformation that Paul David Tripp is talking about here, is that some of the things that we kind of grouse about and we're frustrated by, that on the other side of that is something called life, that we can give ourselves into it and just accept it. It's a process.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a great example because it also just shows the sheer exhaustion that we feel sometimes and the constant need of what our days look like, whether, some of it's in work, some of it's in, our role as mom and wife and all of that, but that, to your point, like we've kind of come into these roles. We've been called to them if we are in them, and they can give us life and should, if we're on mission for God,
Yeah.
because He's on mission for us, and we can trust in that for sure.
Yes, our children
Um,
should be feeling life from our interactions, not
yes,
death. They shouldn't be feeling death or fear. So anyway,
yeah. No, I think that's great. Thank you for sharing. The other question I have for you that came up, in this chapter, and I know we're going to be throwing out terms where we're like, oh, well, there's a chapter on character later, but I think they all merge so well together. And this one might sound like a character question, but it is in this chapter a process, and it talks about just some of the qualities of Christ, and that we are called to this higher standard of ambassador parenting, that takes a little bit more work because we have to reflect, Christ's character. So, what has been one of these character traits of Christ? I mean, I know I often say we can go back and look at the fruits of the Spirit as kind of one of our guides to what some of those characteristics are. But what is one of them that kind of took you possibly longer to mold into, and that you've seen yourself growing over the years of parenting?
yeah, another great question. I think, and I've kind of alluded to this in other questions and comments, is that as a younger parent, I had high expectations of my kids. I expected obedience, respect, and so forth. And then I was a consequential kind of parent. given them discipline if they didn't obey. And sometimes that was done with frustration and anger. But behind all that, I felt was biblical instruction. And then Anna Lee came along, and she's adopted and she's broken. I mean, it's just, she does not have the ability to connect emotionally. And it was so obvious to me that the old way of parenting had to be set aside for something that looked more patient and more kind and more full of grace. Like in my older parenting, I would have thought grace was a little bit like cheap love.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Annalie, I felt like grace was perfect love. Grace was long love. And so I felt like God really showed me that and transformed my heart, kind of from being a little bit pharisaical in my parenting, too dogmatic about stuff, too rules based, to being one that is just really, I'm willing to let the Spirit do what he needs to do. And that doesn't mean Annalie gets away with a whole lot, but it means she gets a different daddy in her presence. One more patient, more kind. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you that God is proud of the steps that you've taken towards his character in that way. So well done, Marty. Well done.
Thank you.
Well, let's jump into the next chapter here it's called Lost. And so I think, again, another great example of something that can be applied to ourselves as well as to our parenting. But in this chapter, Paul David Tripp kind of walks through, again, another example of why we should not just necessarily focus on the wrong behaviors of our children, but that we should just really hone into the condition of their heart. And that we should actually just recognize right off the bat that our children are lost and that they need some structure and some guidance when it comes to finding their way back to their Savior. So he highlights 3 stories in this chapter. One is the lost sheep, one is the lost coin, and the other is of the prodigal son. And so he highlights in these that, first off, a sheep needs a shepherd, so someone that can guide them. A sheep is also prone to wander away from what is always right. And so it needs someone who can go and find them and kind of bring them back to where they are safe. And then also that a sheep is incapable of rescuing itself. And so we are all in need of a savior. And so the question I had for you, Marty, from this chapter is, what's an example of a time when one of your own children believed this lie of either autonomy or self-sufficiency, that they either had it all together themselves or that, of course, they were right in the matter? And how did that come to be? Like, what was the conclusion of this example for them?
Well, I have one child. I am not going to say their name. Who embodies both the idea of being autonomous and self-sufficient at the same time. And neither one is true. And so we've had a scenario, phones are the big thing. It's ironic that with my younger children, phones were not the big thing. My younger two never had phones until they were much older. But now, phones just become the end all be all. It's where they have groups and they can download things. And so we've had our scenarios where we've had to limit phone use. We've found conversations that are not the best kind of conversations. And then we get some arguments and conversations and so forth as a result. But there was one instance where one of my children was in a group, and the kind of conversation that they were having was, number one, foolish. Number two, it was reckless. And number three, it was downright like illegal. Like there was some people commenting on stuff that was absolutely wrong. And when we brought this conversation to the forefront to say, hey, we've seen this. We're going to make you get out of this group. You're going to give us your phone. There's going to be some results to this. The blindness showed up. It's like, I don't see the problem. What is the matter with this conversation? So forth and so on. And I think the old Marty would have tried to force like an awakening.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to do a little bit of that. And then I just said, you know what? I'm your parent. And someday I think you'll understand that what you've been dealing with is just um, actually kind of dangerous. And so we're going to set some limits. We're going to make your world just a little bit smaller. And we love you like crazy. We want to give you your phone back. But these kind of groups, run away from them, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we plant the seeds with love, and we hope that there's a harvest of wisdom and righteousness. But that's one illustration of, where we had to kind of get in there. And I think the phone is a big place for this kind of activity that we're talking about, especially with our middle schoolers and high schoolers.
Yes, there's a lot of space for wandering off into different, avenues and channels that, would be hard to kind of come back from at times. So,
Right, right.
uh, well, thank you for sharing your example. And thank you for taking the time again today for exploring these topics in a little bit more depth. And we will let you all get to your table discussion times now, and we'll see you next week.
Bye bye.
Thanks.